Hello there. If you're listening to this recording, you are probably also looking at my poster on women's suffrage strategies, mainly focusing on the state-by-state versus the federal amendment strategies. The purpose of this recording is mainly to just give you some context and help you sort through all the tiny print on the screen. Basically, I focus on the period from 1869 onwards, where there was the first major split in the movement. But in order to really understand how that came about, you got to go back and understand that the early suffrage movement, which started with the Declaration of Sentiments at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, was very closely allied to the abolitionist movement. And so when the Civil War ended and Reconstruction happened, and the Reconstruction amendments were introduced, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the most suffragists supported the 14th and 13th Amendments, but when the 15th Amendment came up for ratification, it sharply divided the suffrage movement. The 15th Amendment, if you don't know, gives African Americans the right to vote, and African American men it would have been at this time. And so the suffragists were, half of the suffragists essentially were up in arms over the fact that they didn't think African American men should get the right to vote when white women did not have the right to vote, and so they refused to support the 15th Amendment. The other half of the suffrage movement supported the 15th Amendment in the hopes that once African American men got the right to vote, they would use that vote to help give women the right to vote. And so that difference over the 15th Amendment led to the split of the suffrage movement into two different factions. One, the side that supported the 15th Amendment formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, and the side that was against the National Amendment supported or formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is the NWSA. And these associations also had competing strategies for how best to achieve women's suffrage. The AWSA thought that it would be best to pursue a state-by-state strategy. It'd be fastest and easiest. The NWSA thought it'd be faster and easier to pursue a federal amendment strategy for achieving women's suffrage nationwide all at once. As I'm sure you know, the 15th Amendment was successfully ratified, and so in 1890, the AWSA and the NWSA, without that major source of contention between them, will eventually merge back together to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. However, the disagreements between the two with regards to strategy persisted into the NAWSA, and that organization kind of pursued both strategies in parallel, but in an uncoordinated way, pretty much right up until the final years before the 19th Amendment actually successfully passed and was ratified. If you're interested in a much more detailed description of how the dynamic between the two strategies actually played out, you can read more about it in my actual full project, which is somewhere on the symposium. I'm recording this before everything is put together, so I'm not sure entirely where, but I'm sure that it will be easily accessible by some way. Anyway, so now I'm just going to walk through some of the primary sources that I used over the course of my project. The first one was the Declaration of Sentiments, which was essentially the founding document of the women's suffrage movement. It came out of the Seneca Falls Convention. It was modeled off of the Declaration of Independence, and it was kind of a list of a bunch of the rights women were being denied, and kind of provided a roadmap of the issues the women's rights movement would go on to try to address. The second primary source I used is the Constitution of the AWSA. It really reflects the state-by-state focus of that organization. It calls for supporting state suffrage organizations and submitting petitions for suffrage amendments to the state legislatures, which obviously is a key component of going state by state. The third one I used was the NWSA's. It's a petition by them submitted to Congress, one of their earliest ones in the 1870s. It was essentially submitted to Congress and proposing a federal amendment to grant women's suffrage. Obviously, it was not seriously considered by Congress. The NWSA had no illusions that it would be. It was more just to try to gain awareness than anything else at that point. But it does reflect the NWSA's focus on achieving suffrage through a national federal amendment strategy. The fourth one I used is a very interesting one. It's part or an extract of Carrie Chapman Catt's book, Women's Suffrage by Constitutional Amendment, and it essentially addresses the major roadblocks the state-by-state campaign was running into. Essentially, they would successfully get suffrage amendments brought before state legislatures, and they would get a majority of the support of state legislatures in many cases. But because in order to amend a state constitution, most states require supermajorities of, say, 2/3 or even sometimes 3/4 of the legislature in agreement, the amendment would still get defeated by minorities in that state. And even if it did pass the legislature, sometimes it would get voted down by the general voters, or sometimes it would pass both and then be overturned in a court battle, or it would just run into a bunch of constitutional technicalities within the state constitutions that would prevent it. So there are all these roadblocks that Carrie Chapman Catt is detailing, and she uses that as a compelling argument why, if you ever really want to get suffrage nationwide, you're going to have to do it just through a blanket federal amendment. Carrie Chapman Catt, she doesn't really do it in this book, but she does in other speeches and writing in other places acknowledge that the state-by-state campaign is very important for the success of the federal amendment strategy, and it would be even more useful if it's actually implemented in coordination with the federal amendment strategy by using it less to try to achieve suffrage in every single state, but more to target the states with large congressional delegations, and so that those states' congressional delegations are more sympathetic to suffrage when considering a national suffrage amendment in Congress. And in fact, they used that to great effect in New York in 1917, and that's one of the big reasons why Congress ends up passing the 19th Amendment in 1919. And Carrie Chapman Catt called this her winning plan, the idea that if you pursue the state-by-state and federal amendment strategies together in a coordinated way, you could achieve a lot more than if you try to pursue each one separately from the other. The final one, the primary source I used was the actual 19th Amendment. It was first submitted to Congress all the way back in 1878, as it was then the 16th Amendment. By the time it was actually ratified in 1920, it became the 19th Amendment. Had a very long road to actually being passed and ratified, but it represented the culmination of the state-by-state and federal amendment strategies combined. Without one, it would have been really hard to have the other, because federal amendments, even once they pass Congress, they still have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, and without the groundwork laid by the state-by-state campaigners, it would have been very difficult for that to have been achieved. Also, as you can see, I put some of the key dates of the suffrage movement at the top along the little timeline there. That you've got the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments. You have in 1869, Wyoming becomes the first to grant women's suffrage. It was actually a territory at the time, wasn't even a state. Also in 1869, you had the suffrage movement split into the AWSA and the NWSA. In 1878, you had the future 19th Amendment introduced to Congress for the first time. It would be reintroduced in every session of Congress from then until 1920. In 1890, the AWSA and the NWSA merged back to form the NAWSA, and in 1919, Congress passes the 19th Amendment. In 1920, Tennessee becomes the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and that ratification fight in Tennessee is a first-class political drama, and if you don't know much about it, I highly suggest you look into it. It's very entertaining. Down at the bottom, there is the map of when some of the states granted suffrage. As you can see, The state-by-state campaign was most successful in the West, where they essentially achieved suffrage in every state except New Mexico before the 19th Amendment was passed. They also had success in the Midwest and somewhat in the Northeast, especially with getting presidential suffrage before the 19th Amendment. And as you can see, though, the main roadblock the state-by-state campaign faced was in the South, where there was pretty much a solid block of no support for suffrage, which was essentially what drove people to understanding that a federal amendment would be needed if you were going to achieve suffrage nationwide. So, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting, learned something. If you want to know more, obviously you can check out my full project. Thank you. Have a good day.